All right, it's time to review another Planeswalker. We got Dack Fayden, who's a red and blue dual color Planeswalker. A lot of people are very fond of Dack Fayden the Vanguard, so I think there are high hopes for this Planeswalker, or at least high expectations for it to live up to that Vanguard. So let's get into it. How good of a Planeswalker is he? Take a look at his stats. 125 hit points. That's really good. Got no problem there. Kind of on the high end of hit points, so always good to see that. Oh, I don't think I say so otherwise, but his deck limits, he can have up to 6 creatures, 6 spells, and 7 supports. So that's pretty good. I have no problem with that. Maybe some people might want more than 6 spells, but he's not really spell-based like a guy like Rawl, for example. And you don't really need a Rawl clone, right? You already have a Rawl, so we can do some different things with Dack Fayden. And I chose to build a different type of deck than what I would with Rawl. So his mana bonuses are pretty good too. He's got +5 to blue and red. That's excellent for a dual color Planeswalker. And he also gets 2 mana on black. So he's basically got the Kasmina spread. So we got super high mana bonuses on his on-color match, a +2 on one of the other of the 3 remaining colors, and then -2 on green and white. So there is a pretty steep drop-off there when you're not matching to those colors. But built so that there are color matches for you to take advantage of and try to mitigate the negative mana bonuses. Okay, let's talk about his abilities. Prodigious Skill, his first ability, costs 6 loyalty, so that's pretty cheap. Discard a card and draw 2 cards. If the discarded card had no mana, gain 15 mana. Okay, this ability has already become one of my favorite first abilities in the game because that is, for 6 loyalty, such a great advantage in mana. Gaining 15 mana, most of the time in normal circumstances, you're going to draw a card that you can discard at the beginning of your turn and gain that 15 mana. So basically you're converting a card with no mana into 2 new cards and 15 mana. So that's a great trade-off there. And it's a great one for the early game, right? Because that's when you're going to want all that mana. It's going to be the most crucial. I mean, really, any time in the game, gaining 15 mana is going to be relevant at the beginning of your turn. But I feel like this really helps you get going fast. And it really helps enable you to get your strategies going. And we'll talk about that when we get into the decks that I built for him. Second ability, Subterfuge Mastery. Destroy an opposing support card at random. If that card was a non-simple, non-token artifact, create a copy of that card into play under your control. Then reinforce that card 3 times. Otherwise, deal 8 damage to the first opposing creature. So this one can be useful for sure. A lot of times, I've been able to get some really disruptive supports off the battlefield with it. Things like Suppression Bonds, Hixis, Assimilation Aegis, things like that you definitely don't want your opponent to keep around. Yeah, it's a little bit less useful when your opponent is playing a lot of other supports. So this ability can be very useful, but it also can be just kind of meh. If your opponent isn't playing a lot of artifacts, then at least non-token artifacts, then the second part of the ability maybe doesn't do a lot for you. But, dealing 8 damage to the first opposing creature most of the time can be pretty useful. If you can wipe out a support card and a creature at the same time, then great. Then this ability comes in really handy. But for the most part, I feel that his first ability is more useful in more situations. Red Hand Tool. Ability 3. Create 3 Ancient Dagger tokens. Then deal X damage to your opponent's Planeswalker. X is the number of artifact supports you control, including their reinforcements. So I have yet to really build for this. I'm sure that I could if I really tried, but most of my decks that I've used don't really work with this as a win con for the most part. I think it just does a little bit to speed up a win that you are already probably going to have. I'll admit I haven't really done a lot to try and maximize the damage that you can get out of this ability. So what does this ancient dagger token do? So it's an artifact, 4 shields, colorless, and has level. So it creates 3 of them, so it'll end up being a 12 shield token support when you do this at level 60, right? So at the beginning of your turn, gain X mana. X is the number of your opponent's greatest mana bonus, up to 15. So most of the time, it's not giving me a lot of mana. There's a few times, like I've gone against Vraska. That mana bonus is, I believe, +9 to black. So you're going to get like 9 mana at the beginning of your turn, which is great. But for the most part, it's only giving you like 3 to 5 mana, at least in the times that I've used them. Yeah, if you're going, up against like Wrenn and Realmbreaker, then it's going to be giving you a lot more mana. But at the same time, you'd rather have Wrenn and Realmbreaker not have their third ability on the battlefield than trying to take advantage of it with this ability. And then also when your opponent converts gems during their turn, increase this card's level by 1. So you can see what they're kind of setting you up for. It's a little bit like trying to be like World Soul's Rage. And then at the beginning of your turn, deal Y damage to your opponent's Planeswalker. Y is 3 times this card level. Then the support loses 1 shield. So it's just going to slowly build up levels, not nearly to the same degree as World Soul's Rage. It's a little bit to help punish your opponent for casting a lot of conversion cards and all that. But from what I've seen in my play testing, it hasn't really been that big of an advantage to have the ability to put some of that damage back on them. I feel like the amount of advantage that your opponent gets by playing a lot of conversion isn't really offset by this ability alone. So that's just something to keep in mind. I feel like his third ability can situationally be fairly relevant, but for me, it just didn't do a lot. It was kind of meh for me. It's definitely got some use for it. It's a cheap ability at only 13 loyalty, so that's a pretty good plus for it. But in terms of actual utility, I think I'd rather just spam his first ability a lot more than just using the third ability all that often. So his pros. His first ability is a fantastic way to get a fast start on your opponent by gaining 15 mana and drawing 2 new cards. And they're great mana gains on his colors. His cons, though, the second ability can be useful, but is mainly dependent on your opponent casting supports or creating them. And then a lot of times if it's a token support, your opponent usually wants those to be broken or destroyed. So sometimes it doesn't do a lot for you. And then his third ability needs both your deck to be built for it or a certain type of opposing deck to be very strong. I haven't really built for it to be a really strong win con. I'm sure somebody can figure that out, but it just wasn't something that I felt the need to do because I really like the decks that I built for him, and I'm looking forward to sharing those with you now. Let's do it. All right, so this deck is one that I built specifically for a peasant objective in PvE. I want to say Face the Hydra, but I've used it in just normal training grounds, and it's held its own. I think it's only lost once or twice in my testing, so pretty solid deck. So basically, we're going to be creating a ton of gold tokens and going to be gaining mana and cards in a few different ways. We got Niv Mizzet, Guild Pact, pretty strong creature, 17 mana rare, 6/6 but it has flying and hexproof and is all colors. When this creature deals combat damage to your opponent's planeswalker, deal X damage to the first opposing creature and gain X life, then draw X cards. X is the number of colors with 5 or more gems on the board. So a lot of times this will do about 5 damage, 4 or 5 damage to your opponent's planeswalker. So I mostly like this card for the draw. This deck doesn't particularly have a lot of different ways of getting a lot of cards in your hand like some of my other decks do. So you need to have it built into a few of your other cards. Then we got Jolene, Plundering Pugilist. It's a really nice uncommon. It's only 10 mana and it's a 6/5, so that's pretty good for an uncommon already. I feel like the power level of that is more in line with a rare or even mythic, but it is a human mercenary, so she's an outlaw. When a creature you control attacks, if that creature has power 4 or more, create 2 gold tokens. And then all of our creatures are going to have a power of 6 or more. So we're covered there. When a simple token you control is destroyed, deal 2 damage to the first opposing creature. So that is a really nice part of this card too, because you get some extra creature destruction built in with all the gold tokens we're going to be creating. And then your opponent can destroy those simple tokens and it will still affect them. So not only are we going to be getting the 3 mana from the gold token, but your opponent's creatures are going to be taking 2 damage every time. And then we got Trumpeting Carnosaur, which is a 13 mana 7/6 dinosaur with trample. When this creature enters the battlefield, discover 4. So there's a little bit of extra cards in your hand, giving them some mana. Then when this creature attacks, deal 3 damage to the first opposing creature. So that's another way that we're going to be whittling down your opponent's creatures. So all of these creatures are going to be dealing damage to your opponent creature every turn, and that's going to make it a little bit difficult for them to keep creatures on the board. Hell to Pay. So very versatile, very strong red spell. Deal X damage to target creature or planeswalker. So it is a targeted spell, but you then create X gold tokens. X is the number of red gems on the board. And yeah, depending on how many red gems are on the board is how effective this card will be. But it's almost always going to be creating a handful of gold tokens. I'd say it's like an average of 5 that it creates for me. So it's not doing a ton of damage, but I'd say the main reason to use this card is for the gold token creation. So it's going to be giving you ways to gain mana. Hit the Mother Load. I've been a fan of this card for a while. When you cast this card, discover 4, then discover 4. So that's 2 cards that you get to choose from the next 4 cards in your library. And then you put half their mana into them when they're in your hand. And then you're also creating 4 gold tokens. So you're getting a lot of mana just from casting this spell. So it's great in that way. Cut Your Losses. Converting gems to blue, hopefully giving us some cascades and mana there. And that will be further putting more mana into our hand. Involuntary Cooldown. I don't know how many people use this card, but it's great. Up to the first 2 opposing creatures gain stun counter 2, and then disable those cards until end of turn. So this will make sure that most of the time you'll be able to take care of a card like Phyrexian Vindicator, Faithbound Judge, any of those creatures with prevent damage. You'll still be able to take them out because you're going to be disabling them, and then you can deal direct damage to them with the Jolene, Niv Mizzet, and the Carnosaur. Leyline of the Guild Pact and Cryptics, just my 2 favorite cards in Standard to gain for mana conversion. So this is just to make sure that we have at least a chance to have a lot of red gems on the board for Hell to Pay to be most effective. But, it's a great way to get a lot of mana either way. And then finally, Molten Collapse. Well, Molten Collapse is still bugged in that it's exiling instead of destroying. I mean, most of the time, I prefer a card to exile rather than destroy, to deal with, Lord Xander and other cards like that. I also like that this card can affect Vanguard supports. So this is going to be a really useful card. I already use this card a lot more than Void Rend at this point, though I do like Void Rend, but it's not my go-to removal spell anymore like it used to be. Molten Collapse has really taken that title for me lately. I don't play any cards with Descend, so that part of it never really mattered to me. But yeah, so with all the ways to get rid of creatures, then you have Molten Collapse coming in and taking care of the rest of the things that your opponent can play. But you can also use a second ability to take care of supports too. But yeah, pretty well balanced deck. It goes through training grounds pretty easily, and it's kind of fun. So I hope you enjoy this deck, and let's get into some of the ones that are a little bit more my style of building. All right, so this deck is all about creating a loop with supports. So some of the inspiration was taken from one of Gauze's recent loop deck videos. And this one was inspired a lot by this card, Roxanne Starfall Savant, which I know a lot of people aren't playing this card right now, but that may change. It is a cat druid. It's red and green. When this creature enters the battlefield or attacks, create a small meteorite token. So that small meteorite token is a support card. It's an artifact token. When this support enters the board, deal 2 damage to your opponent's planeswalker. At the beginning of your turn, convert 2 gems of your planeswalker's color to gems of your opponent's planeswalker's color. So that's a little bit of a downside. You're converting away from yourself into your opponent. Sometimes that will mess you up. It hasn't been a big deal for me, but it is something to be aware of. Don't think that this card is bugged, because usually a lot of times when you're converting, it's supposed to be the other way around, and it works like this card is supposed to. So don't be alarmed if you see that happening. The main reason this card is in my deck, though, is for the second sentence there. When an artifact support is reinforced, gain 6 mana. So there are a few artifacts in this deck, but we're going to have ways of getting them a little easier. So that gaining 6 mana goes to the first card in your hand. And then when we talk about the rest of the deck, you'll see why that's even more relevant. So we got Virtue of Knowledge and Urza's Saga, and these two together, this is how you play this. You cast Virtue of Knowledge first, and then you go to the third chapter of Urza's Saga, fetch the first artifact card from your library, and it gains mana equal to the amount of loyalty you have, then destroy this support. So what happens is, if you play Urza's Saga with the third chapter and Virtue of Knowledge is on the board, it will create a copy of Urza's Saga that will then cast again. And as long as you have enough loyalty, you'll be fetching that artifact, giving it all the mana it needs to be casted, and then Virtue of Knowledge will copy that artifact as well. So you're not only are going to be copying Urza's Saga, but you'll also be copying the artifact every time you cast those two. So with Roxanne, that's going to be reinforcing an artifact support, right? So you're going to be gaining 6 mana every time that artifact that Urza's Saga is fetched gets reinforced. And here's a nice artifact. Assimilation Aegis. It's a 3 shield support. It is 15 mana, so it's a little bit on the heavier side to cast, but it's not too bad. Assimilation Aegis is in just about every deck now that can handle it, because it's the best single card against GTA. All those cards, the G, the T, and the A, all depend on the enter the battlefield effect that they all have. So being able to stop that means that you're going to slow those types of decks down by a lot. And they rely heavily on all the mana gained from those creatures entering the battlefield. So if you stop even one of those creatures, they are usually really expensive to cast even. So it's a great way to at least get this one down as early as possible, and then it will buy you some time to get your strategy set up. Commodore Guff. This is a great card for this deck because with all the copying of supports, you're going to be having tons of shields on all the supports you're going to be casting and copying and doing all that. So you're going to be able to use his -2 or his -7 to either gain tons of mana because of all the shields on the supports, but also you can do damage, and you can do a lot of damage with Guff by taking the total shield of support cards that you're going to be copying. So you'll see in the battle where I'm just over and over again, as long as I want to, keep the Urza Saga Virtue and Knowledge combo happening, and then when I'm ready, use Commodore Guff's -7 to win. So it's a pretty fun way to win. Molten Collapse we just talked about. And then Ichor Moon Gauntlet. This is a really good artifact to have in this deck because, well, this one is going to be proliferating and escalating. So it's going to be raising up the shields of Guff, and we'll likely be able to get an extra swap, get things going again. But when you cast a support spell card, proliferate, escalate. So we're going to be, when we're casting all those supports in our little Virtue of Knowledge loop, we're going to be raising the shields of our Guff as well. But I mostly like it because it's an artifact and it's going to be getting us some extra swaps. So that's great. And then Captain Ripley Vance. And this card is mainly in our deck because when you cast a support, the first card in your hand gains 9 mana. So we're going to be casting so many supports, and not only are we going to be gaining 9 mana from Captain Ripley Vance whenever we do that, if it's an artifact, we're going to be gaining an extra 6 mana from Roxanne, and then we also have Satoru giving us extra mana. Right now, in its current state, we're still gaining mana from casting supports, so that's an extra 4 mana for every time we do that. Basically, just as long as we're casting non-spell cards, it's giving us the mana. So every artifact support can theoretically give us 19 mana every time we cast one when you combine Satoru, Vance, and Roxanne. So that's great, right? And then the last support we have in here is Storm-Carved Coast. And, if you get this one out early, it's going to be converting gems to blue or red. But it's mainly here because you can double up with the cards in your hand gaining mana by casting this with Virtue of Knowledge on the battlefield. So it's a pretty complex combo happening here. I don't know how well Greg will play this deck, but I bet it will shock people when you see all this mana just continuously going into your hand, and it just keeps going and going like a freight train, and then you just hit that Commodore Guff -7 and win if your creatures aren't yet large enough to swing for the kill in that regard. But you could try also, instead of Storm-Carved Coast, Kylox's Volt Strider. Storm-Carved Coast is mainly there to keep a loop going, but if you find you don't need it that much, Volt Strider is going to be great because it's going to be giving all of your creatures a big buff, and it's an artifact, so Virtue of Knowledge and Roxanne can take advantage of that. All right, well, I have another fun combo deck to share with you here. All right, so this deck is mainly built around the fun things you can do with Knowledge is Power. When Knowledge is Power was first spoiled people kind of lost their minds about it. People thought that it was just going to be too game-breakingly powerful and it was going to be nerfed and all this other stuff. But then, people cooled down on it. I think people tried it, realized that it wasn't the game-breaking card that they thought it would be. And so I don't see a lot of people talking about it or using it in a lot of builds. I don't know if that's just because it's a masterpiece and therefore that much harder to get. But believe me, guys, you want this card. It is busted, super ridiculous, powerful. Maybe you just didn't think about it enough. Maybe it wasn't quite the plug and play you thought it was going to be, but it's really easy to build around. And I'll show you how to do that. So when you draw a card during your turn, reinforce each creature you control until end of turn, then gain 2 mana. So we're reinforcing each creature every time we draw a card. But we lose those reinforcements at the end of your turn. But there are a lot of cards that take advantage of losing reinforcements. For example, Lord Xander the Collector. When this creature dies or loses a reinforcement, destroy half of the opposing cards at random, rounded down. So if your opponent gets a pretty fast start on you, but you're able to get Knowledge's Power and Lord Xander and maybe some card draw happening, then you're just going to be destroying most of what they have available on the board for them. We also have Rakdos the Muscle. So this card is awesome. It was a card that I didn't pay enough attention to, but then a few people in Discord gave me some ideas. Now I've really taken and ran with it. So when another creature you control dies or loses a reinforcement, exile the top X cards of your opponent's library. And this is the part I love. Gain X mana. X is that creature's base power. So right now, he is a little bugged in that he is taking into account your creature's total power, not just the base power. But even so, if you have enough of a loop going and you reinforce your creatures enough times, every time you lose that reinforcement, as your counter goes back to what it was at the start of your turn, you're going to be gaining that mana, you're going to be exiling your opponent's library. And so a lot of times I'm going to be refilling my hand with mana. And also with Academy Elite, I'm going to be drawing a lot of cards too, because when this creature dies or loses a reinforcement, we're discarding a card and then drawing a card, and it gains 6 mana every time. So you're getting on top of the 6 mana, whatever Rakdos the Muscle puts into that card from your losing the reinforcement. So there's a lot of synergy happening between these 3 creatures. And then the rest of this deck is mainly built to keep getting cards in our hand, drawing them. I love connecting the dots, so that's an easy way of getting Knowledge's Power or any of our other creatures on the board. Lock and Load is awesome because we're drawing 4 cards just for casting it. I know that we lose a lot of cards in that process, but for the most part, if you set up your hand correctly, you'll be casting this at the end of your hand. So you cast everything first, and then Lock and Load is the last thing you cast. So hopefully taking advantage of all the other cards first before Lock and Load goes off. But then you get the 2 cards with full mana after casting it. And then I never remember to use Plotted, but the plotted part of this card is not bad either. Return each opposing creature to your opponent's hand. So if that's something that you want to try and use as well, though I haven't had a lot of reason to use that part of it with this deck because it kind of just shreds through everybody even without having a lot of removal in it. We got Molten Collapse in here just in case you need it, but you're going to be winning with this deck pretty easily without a lot of removal anyway. Follow the Bodies. I love it. You know why I love it. We're just going to be, because of Lock and Load, between Lock and Load and Lord Xander the Collector, we're going to be putting things in our graveyard and our opponent's graveyard. So creating enough clue tokens for Follow the Bodies to go off with the Collect Evidence it's not going to be that big of an issue a lot of times. So should be pretty easy to trigger Follow the Body's evidence collection effect. And then finally, this is a fun win con. Definitely not the only win con that you could use, but Unlicensed Hearse is at the beginning of combat on your turn, you may exile the first 2 cards from your opponent's graveyard or from target player's graveyard. If you don't, you almost always want to don't. Creatures you control with pilot 2 or greater get +X/+X until end of turn. X is the number of cards in all exiles. And why does that matter? Because Rakdos is going to be exiling your opponent's library like a mofo. So that is why Unlicensed Hearse is in here. And as you'll see in this battle, my opponent's exile is to an absurd amount. So that is usually going to be the game ender for us. But, knowledge is power. If we get into a nice loop with lock and load and follow the bodies, you're not even going to need that Hearse. Your Rakdos, your Academy Elite, and even your Xander are going to be strong enough to take care of things on their own. So this deck does take a little bit of setting up to get there, but it really just steamrolls once it gets going. So I hope you enjoy watching it do its thing. And yeah, let's get into the grades for Dack Fayden. Okay, final grades for Dack Fayden. Max hit points, very solid, giving him an A+. Mana spread. I really like this type of mana spread. Maybe it's not everybody else's cup of tea, but I give it an A+. I really like having a lot of mana on his on-color matches. Makes it easy when I use something like Leyline and Cryptex together to get a lot of mana coming my way every turn. Ability 1. I love this ability. I give it an S+. One of the best in the game, I want to say. The only, I guess, drawback that I would have is that you don't get to choose what 2 cards you get next, but that 15 mana that you get is just really comes in clutch. It's kind of like Narset's second ability, but way cheaper and way more versatile. Ability 2, I give it a B. It can be very useful in certain situations. You can need to get a pesky support off the board, and it will eventually do that for you. I wonder if you get into a long battle, you have to spam this ability to get the support off the field that you want, but it's there for you to take advantage of. Ability 3, giving it a B-. Like I said, there is untapped potential for it to be really strong, but it just hasn't been one that I've really felt the need or to build around. So if you want to do that for yourself, have at it. I think it can be potentially a pretty solid ability, but it isn't really much of a game changer right out of the box. Versatility. So I find him to be a pretty versatile planeswalker. He reminds me a bit of a Garruk Cursed Huntsman, where his abilities are pretty solid, all of them on their own. So you're not locked into a specific style of play. I guess if you wanted to build around artifacts, you can use his third ability, so it can make your third ability more advantageous, but it's not necessary at all. That first ability in the early game is really where it's all at for me. So I give him an A+ in versatility. Card utility. So I don't think his abilities do a lot to make your cards that you use any better. But then again, you really don't have to fight with his abilities to make your cards shine. So I think that just makes him a really solid planeswalker in that regard, where he's just good at using a lot of different types of cards. I guess he gets a slight bump if you use more artifacts for his third ability, but it's really not necessary. I was able to win easily just off of the strength of the rest of his abilities and what you can build around for him. So I give him an A-. And fun. Because there's no big gimmick about him, I find him just a really solid planeswalker to build around. He's not super exciting in that way, but he is a really good planeswalker just if you like that color combo of blue and red. He's not like the spell slinger that Rawl is, and maybe that's more fun for you. But he's just a good all-around planeswalker that you can use in a lot of different events, and he'll do well in them. So I give him an A- for fun. And what does that leave us with for a final grade? I give him an A-. Very solid planeswalker. I would say that if you want to pick him up for money, that he would be a pretty solid purchase. He is a definite pickup for crystals because you're just going to get a lot of utility out of him. He's not going to be somebody that really changes the game for you in that way, but I think I would recommend him for just about every collection. Newer player without a lot of blue and red in their kit, this is good too. A new player that needs to cover both blue and red, he is very good for that. So yeah, I would definitely recommend spending some resources on him, whatever you feel is within your budget, whether that's cash or in-game crystals. He definitely gets a thumbs up from me. All right, well, I hope that you got a lot out of watching this review. I hope you like some of the decks that I built for him. And yeah, let me know what you guys think. How will you be picking him up? Also, if you're not interested in him, I kind of want to know the reasons why. I feel like I made a pretty good case for him. But after all that, if you're still negative on him, let me know why. All right, see you in the next video.